All right, so we are live. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for our Black History Month series. We hope that you've enjoyed our programming and panels thus far, and we have another dynamic conversation tonight. So before we begin, we'd like to open with a land, labor, and life acknowledgement, recognizing that this country was built on the stolen labor and land of Indigenous people and lives of our African ancestors. So the land that we're physically situated on is that of the Wyandotte, Shawnee, Lenape, and Seneca Cayuga tribes. We pay respect to all Indigenous people and their continuing presence on this homeland and throughout the historical diaspora. We also pay homage to those stolen from Africa, placed in bondage, and forced into labor, who were enslaved but never submitted as such in their spirits, who've always been fully human with an unbroken connection to the divine and to each other. We honor our enslaved ancestors who risked their lives walking in the shallows next to the bank of the Olentangy, up from the Ohio River to Canada. We honor the courage of the 35 freedmen and women who voyaged from North Carolina and settled on Africa Road and North State Street right here in Delaware County. We pay respect and homage to our Indigenous ancestors and African forebears, past, present, and future. So tonight's discussion, I'll be honest, it raised a couple of eyebrows and we've received some critical feedback. And, why are we centering white women during Black History Month? What's that about? And it was a fair assessment, right? We always are open to feedback, how we can do things better. But, it really allowed us to expand the dialogue. So I had to take a look back in history. And history reminds us that there's been no civil rights movement, social justice movement that did not include that of a multi-ethnic or cultural coalition. So when you think back to the founding of the NAACP in 1909, it was co-founded by white progressives, Mary White Ovington, Henry Moskowitz, and a couple others, right? Black Panthers, when you think about how they partnered with the Puerto Rican Young Lords, white young patriots, Students for a Democratic Society, they formed a coalition that was class conscious and it was inspired about being against white supremacist capitalism. The 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, attended by 250 multi-ethnic activists. 1965, at the time of the passage of the Voting Rights Act, there were 6 African Americans in the US House of Representatives, no Black people in the US Senate. How did that pass? Multi-ethnic, multicultural coalition. So tonight, it takes all of us. And that's really the overarching message. It takes all of us. And it may not be your experience, right? But it is your responsibility. And that is true allyship. So with that, I want to introduce our friends for this evening, Whitney Gherman, Victoria Farris. Again, dynamic conversation that will happen here shortly. Thank you for being with us and enjoy tonight.
Thank you so much, Tamika. Thank you for that nice introduction and for laying the historical context for the conversation that Victoria and I will have with all of you as you listen via Facebook Live. Feel free to put in the comments the questions that you have or statements that you want to give. We want to make this as interactive as we can through the technology that we have available. But truly, thank you, Delaware African American Heritage Council, for your trust in Victoria and I, and your willingness to hold this space. Since 2019, every year during Black History Month, there's been some kind of allyship event. And I'm so excited to introduce Delaware, Ohio to Victoria Farris tonight. Victoria, do you want to share a little bit about yourself and where you're calling in from?
Sure. Thanks, Whitney. And thanks, Delaware, Ohio, for having me and the welcome. I am currently where I live, but in Long Island, New York. So I live just outside New York City. I am, a queer white mom to 2 kids who are hopefully doing their homework on the other side of this wall. You want me to kind of talk a little bit about just kind of who I am in the world and how we
and I'll kind of share how Victoria and I met before we get into our dialogue tonight.
Okay, great. Yeah. I actually run my own business is doing consulting and coaching, specifically around equity and inclusion largely, but my research and my kind of focus area is specifically on the ways that white folks can disrupt systems of racism. And increasingly over the last couple of years, following the murder of George Floyd, the patterns and behaviors and engagement of white folks has shifted in a number of ways. And it's my work, I think, has done the same. And so recently I've really taken a deeper interest in white womanhood and what it means to have been socialized into white womanhood and how that positions us in the sort of social hierarchy of race and identity. And so I was just so excited when you asked me to join you for this conversation. So thanks, Whitney.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I'll introduce myself because not everyone in Delaware, Ohio knows me. So I'm Whitney Gherman. I use she, her pronouns, and my family and I have lived here since 2017. I'm raising a white girl who attends Woodward Elementary School. And, I do this work, during the daytime, professionally doing a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But outside of my day job, I'm really committed to justice and am a proud member of the Delaware African American Heritage Council. I often co-facilitate some programs with Tamika and other members throughout the year. And in the last 2 years have really started to focus on the inner work of racial justice and shifting my attention to white people who, in 2020, we had this racial reckoning, right? Who attended a book club in 2020 or a webinar or some kind of event related to racial justice. Unfortunately, some of those efforts have died down, and we really want to renew the conversation and the call to white people to be accountable throughout the year, not just during Black History Month, and lifelong, not just during a national tragedy. And so as I was looking back over the years, and someone recently made this post on Instagram to remind me of Angela Peoples' work. There was a New York Times article that she wrote titled, "Don't Just Think Black Women, Follow Us." And if you just Google that article, you come across a really powerful image that she posted. And it showed this stark contrast between progressive white women who view themselves like in this pink hat and girl power signs compared to Angela in front with the sign. And that contrast really stood out to me because often the way racism looks in white women, particularly progressive white women, is not always talked about. We tend to think of these big characteristics of racism, but tonight we want to get into more of the subtle ways that progressive white women do harm and perpetuate racial harm, particularly against Black women. And so to start us off, Victoria, I know you've got to see that photo before. You've probably read that article, and that's just one example. There's been so many great articles written. In my background, I keep thinking over here because I have a really great book called White Tears, Brown Scars. And that was another great resource during that time of reading that. But how did you enter this space, Victoria? What was your response in reading that article, and what was your life like during 2020?
Yeah, that article really stood out to me. The photo at the top of the article, though, I remember seeing it. I think it was pretty immediately following the first Women's March. It was taken at the Women's March. And I had been at the Women's March in New York City. My sister had gone to DC. I knew a lot of people who had gone. And for me, I was already doing kind of race and equity work. And that image in particular in that article was like a huge, helped me realize how I was compartmentalizing my lived experience and the incredible grief I was experiencing at the election of Donald Trump and the profound misogyny that existed in that time. And I wanted to say leadership. I'm like, I can't even say that word in the same sentence as him, but under his administration, how about that? And I think that that image, though, reminded me that it is so easy for me to center my own pain when I am experiencing harm and feeling marginalized. And even as a person who works to center race in my work, I was still missing something. And so it's really sat with me. And 2020 shifted my life in really big ways because it was the first time I engaged in activism. In June of, I think it was June of 2020, in the height of the family separation. It was actually also the leaders of the Women's March who initiated a protest and called on, particularly, I think it was speaking to white women, saying essentially, it's time to leverage our privilege and stand in solidarity with and for immigrant families and immigrant mothers. And they were coordinating an all women's civil disobedience protests and risking arrest and whatnot, shutting down the Senate. And that is not something I'd ever thought of before. My family still makes fun of me because I was such a rule follower all my life, and now I have more arrests on my record than anyone in family. But what I saw there, and the reason I'm telling this story, is what it looks like to truly center Black women and the women and folks who are most impacted by systemic harm. And I saw how hard it was sometimes as a white woman who's been so, even when it's not conscious to me, so ingrained in I know best and I can just lead, and assuming that other white people are in charge and things like this. But it showed me the power of what Tamika was describing, of seeing a cross-cultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial movement. And, 600 of us sat down and took arrests and shut down the Senate for, the better part of a day. And I feel really proud of being a part of those types of things. But I probably went a little off tangent from what you were asking, but
no, that's I think that it brings up the discussion really nicely, because there was something that you said that just kind of brought my attention to this pattern we have to center our harm. And I think that's why when we talk about whiteness, white supremacy, white privilege, women, we tend to default to the ways men have harmed, because we've been harmed by, men, patriarchy, misogyny. And so white women in the audience that are listening to us tonight, we should know some of this already because we face those similar aggressions. But what we're asking us to do tonight is raise our consciousness that we can oscillate between our gender and our race. And that gives us benefit and advantage. And we're not immune to perpetuating injustice or harm. Instead, we as white women, and we'll often also use the term people who are socialized as girls, we can be accountable to this cause, to people of color, to women of color in our lives, by acknowledging that we have unequal roles. And this is not something that we chose. This is something that we're predisposed into, we're born into. And often when we have these conversations, I think there's maybe pushback because no one has explicitly taught us these norms, right? If it was taught explicitly, it might be an easier solution for us. Instead, it's very nuanced and maybe hard to name, but we each get systematic training on how to be based on our identities. And today we're focusing on what have we learned, what were we culturally taught as women, and particularly as white women. What's that historical legacy, and what do we do about that?
Oh, yes. Because it's so insidious. You're so right that if it were overt teaching, like if there were a class that we got, it would be so much easier to identify how it shows up. And it is really painful, because I think part of the socialization of white girls is this like sort of good girl idea, right? That you are a good girl and you're, at least for me, right? Like how to be a good girl, how to be a lady, how to speak and how to talk and how to not take up too much space and how to be accommodating to everyone around me. And so, you know, my who I understood myself to be was deeply tied to being a good girl, following rules, judging other people who didn't, you know, and engaging in harmony and likability. And now then all of a sudden it's like you have privilege and you should be speaking up, without ever really unpacking that my whole life I was conditioned to not do that. And not just to think it was a bad thing to do, but to not actually know how to do it, because I only knew how to regulate myself in the context of like people patting me on the back and saying like, thank you for doing such a good job today, you know. And like I assure you that there are lots of people who said I was doing a good job, but when you're like, you know, getting arrested, nobody's like, good job, you know. It's like for me, this was like such a contrast of like, they actually did a training for us the day before. And one of the things, it was really life-changing, honestly, Whitney, because it was one of those times where the subtleties became clear in like a workshop setting, where the facilitator said, there's going to be a time where you're going to see the police come, and your automatic thing is going to be to do what they say, because that's what you've been trained to do. And I want you to consciously notice when that happens and take a deep breath and actively decide. And you can decide at that point to get up and walk away, and you won't be arrested. You can do that. And like, that's okay if that's your choice. But if you're choosing to put your body on the line, you're going to have to work against the part of you that's been taught. And I mean, I have goosebumps talking about it again, because I was like, holy, I don't know if I should drop my F-bomb. But like, I didn't realize just how deep that went. And when the police came the next day, I literally linked arms with the woman next to me, and I looked and I said, that I just had that moment. And we took a breath and we were like, we got this, and here we are. But it was one of those moments where I was like, but it made me recognizing that as a person who trains folks, she knew already how I was socialized before I even realized.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be the truth of my experiences and friendships with women of color. Is I owe so much of my healing and self-awareness, because they've often had to work around us, learn us to survive. And knowing our bodies, that is just such a good story, Victoria, because what it brings my attention to is a story that was hundreds of years ago, but of Mary Chestnut, who her and her husband enslaved Africans. And when she would take them to the auction block, she would take opium to block the body's feedback, to block the pain, to block the feeling that something has gone wrong. And in similar ways, whether through your example or just in our everyday lives, we turn away because it's really hard to look at racism in the communities that we love, with the people that we love. And it might be easier to just not make waves. But I really believe, and Matt Segrest writes about this, that there is a soul destroying anesthesia that comes with that power. And there's an emotional life that we give up when we don't acknowledge our role in this system, and when we turn away from the painful parts of our history and present day.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I was having such a visceral reaction just hearing your stories. And it is hard. It's hard for my body to feel that way and to stay engaged in the conversation. And it's like how I remember that I'm human. because I think you're exactly right that the way, and I want to be careful to say, like, I don't blame my mom and dad on the individual level for teaching me how to dissociate from my body and how to people please over self, pleasing self and my own needs and trusting my body. But I do believe that this system is designed this way because, especially if white girls and white women were not deeply ingrained in complicity in the system, it wouldn't work. Because the reality is, if we were truly in cross-racial solidarity, women, people of color, women of color, queer, trans, non-binary folks of color, we are hugely the majority of people in this country, right? And when the majority of people are really in community, power can shift. And I think this system sort of keeps us separated and fighting amongst each other. And even the hierarchy, the oppression Olympics of like, well, it's hard to be a white woman. And yes, it's hard to be a human in a capitalist white supremacist culture because it doesn't value humanity. But I think it is really important to name, without centering or comparing, but naming that white people lose a lot in the system too. And we do, whether it's by actually taking opiates or something else, we do have our ways of numbing to dissociate. Because if we look right at it, most of us don't have the capacity to hold what will come up. And I think that is a huge part of what the work of allyship is. It's building the capacity to look. And to look without crumbling. So I'm not asking you to take care of me because I looked and now I can't handle it, but to start to build the capacity that I can stand next to you. We can look together and I can say, I'm here. And mean it, because in my body, mean it, not just like, I want to be here, but I don't know how to do this.
Yeah, just like you took that breath. You just took that breath in that moment and was able to get centered to do the thing that was aligned with your values and your commitments to racial justice. And I appreciate so much what you said about this isn't working for any of us. The system doesn't honor any body. It elevates certain bodies like white bodies, but it doesn't honor anybody. And I think that's the challenge, is how white people can see that is in their interest to promote racial justice. And Derek Bell, who is like the godfather of critical race theory, talks about interest convergence. And he stipulates that Black people achieve civil rights victories only when white and Black interests converge. And I just really have pondered that for a long time, is how not only to like converge our interest with white people and where they're at, but for them to converge where people of color are at, and recognize that none of us want to grow up with this. None of us want to grow up with white supremacy, but it's going to take some personal disinvestment where we send our kids to school, where we live. It changes our relationships, maybe our marriages, and it's asking a lot from people. What has been what was your moment of turning away, waking up, getting ready?
It's so hard to say when I get asked that question, because I think it's a series of moments that have each one taken me the next step. I grew up in the suburbs outside of Washington, D.C. with parents who didn't shy away from talking about things. Like, I remember, I'm 40, so I was a kid in the 80s, and I remember clearly at about 9 years old having dinner time conversation about AIDS, and my parents telling me, this is what you're going to hear, and this is not true, this is what's real, and this is why it's harmful. And like, I don't know anybody, especially white and suburban, whose parents talked to them about AIDS at 9 years old. Like, I don't know anybody. So I do attribute a lot, and particularly to my dad. My dad didn't in hindsight, it felt like he felt so comfortable, and I'm sure he wasn't, but he didn't shy away from the hard conversations. And it was deeply entrenched with this idea that like Martin Luther King Jr. saved everything, and now we like help people who need help. I mean, there was a lot of white saviorism worked in. It wasn't perfect. But I think because I was often around people who are different than me and my family, and my parents treated them on the individual level like equals, it modeled for me something that I don't know that a lot of suburban white kids get to see up close. And I think that played a role. I think then I've just been fortunate enough to be in relationship with especially Black women. And I say lucky because I am certain that it's just my own dumb luck, because for a long time I was clumsy, and to your point, like needed to receive a lot of feedback and have people who are willing to give a lot of grace and investment. And, you know, one day I was in a meeting, the staff dynamics were, you know, leadership was all white, and then the entry level staff, which I was a part of, was like very multiracial. And two of the Black women were constantly getting their names mixed up, even though they looked nothing alike. And it was like microaggressions always flying. And I remember feeling so proud that I noticed them. And we were leaving and walking to lunch. I was walking with a dear friend who's still a dear friend. This was like 20 years ago. And I said, "Can you believe what so-and-so said? Like, that was so racist." And she just, without missing a beat, said, "You know, maybe next time you can say something when we're in the room and it actually matters."
Wow.
And she doesn't even remember saying that to me. And I remember like it was yesterday, because, and I remember in the moment, like just consciously knowing like you can't fall apart right now. You have to receive this and stay present and enjoy our lunch that we were supposed to go have. Like, it can't be her job to hold me. And I was devastated. Like, I had so much shame. And I think that what I learned from that is that when somebody gives you an invitation and you don't take it, you lose a lot of trust. And so that, I think, was one of the biggest lessons, because it made me realize you can't say you want it and then not deliver when you get it. And so I wanted to be in relationship with this person who then basically gave me my marching orders. And it was really hard when the time came to say, "Can you help me understand what you mean when you say that?" Because I've noticed that we've only been talking about, you know, this group, and to start to like prod. And I think that that's the part I still think about, is like the socialization, this like good girl thing. And then we get our marching orders and it's like, I want to help, but not that.
Yeah.
And we don't get to choose the assignment.
Right. I mean, yes. There's just so much there that I want to unpack. You know, a couple of years ago, I had a friend ask me, like, "Who asked you to do this work?" And that always resonates with me. Like, who am I accountable to? And even as we grounded this conversation of why is this happening, right? Who has asked you to do this work? And I just really appreciate that story. I have a story that is different. I did not have close, intimate friends of color until my late 20s. I grew up in a small white community, and similar to you, I had really great parents that taught me how to love and how to be selfless. And I had there was the white savior components to it too. And I've since grown to just appreciate the effort more than judge it. And I owe a lot to my mom, who laid the groundwork, you know, and that I can interrogate. And then I fully expect my own daughter to interrogate my work and point out its limitations. But that's how we create a new legacy of whiteness without supremacy. It's generational. And I hope for our movement to become more generational here in Delaware, to engage young people and older people. I think for me, when the discomfort of my whiteness became larger than the comfort, I had to make a change. Like, it wasn't serving me anymore to be quiet and to be good and to be obsessed with being innocent. And this is something I'm continually working on, is this obsession around perfection and wanting everyone to like me, because doing racial justice work goes against all the ways I've been socialized as a woman. Is not everyone likes me anymore, and that is really hard.
That's it. I said this recently, and it just, like, the way I said it, like, landed. But as a white woman and white girl, I was not socialized to have the capacity to engage in disrupting white supremacy, because my identity was too tied up in external validation. And when we're constantly outsourcing our validation and our confidence and our sense of self and our worthiness, to disrupt that is to take away our confidence, our worthiness, our wholeness, all of it. And so I do believe, and I think we sort of share this philosophy, that minimally they have to happen in tandem, but there has to be some healing work that happens in order for us to go against whiteness, because white solidarity is deep. It is, I mean, it is the unspoken commitment that you make that you don't break it. And when you do, and I think increasingly the risks are getting bigger. Like, I think I try to remind myself that the violence is still, white people are not the victims of violence in this context. And, the threat of violence is increasing daily from white supremacists and, white, I think, domestic terrorists, right? And so I think it does require a deep level of honesty and of strategy, right? Like, we're both moms. Like, the risk I take is always well thought out and well planned for, because I know reckless decisions on my part could have lasting impacts. And the same is when we're in community with others. So as an activist, if I'm not deeply aware of my whiteness, and I'm at a Black Lives Matter rally or at some protest that is cross-racial, and I provoke the police, I don't put myself in danger. I put the people I'm saying I'm here to stand with in danger. And so I think we have to grapple with how our understanding of ourselves has to change, and that's okay, because I think I love what you said about once my discomfort became bigger than my comfort. And I don't know that I always connected the discomfort to white supremacy culture, but they are the perfectionism, the feeling like I always had to over-explain myself, that I had to doubt myself, that I wasn't trustworthy, that I had to be small, that I had to like sitting on the floor and, coloring or whatever, right? Like, I didn't connect the two at the time, that is all part of it. And we don't have to live this way.
I'm so glad that you named that. That is really helpful. And I hopefully it's helpful to our audience too. And maybe we can put the link in about the characteristics of white supremacy culture. Because let's acknowledge that just for a moment, the perfectionism, the urgency, the right to have comfort. I know I'm missing a few. I don't know if you have more that you want to add.
Yeah, the idea of objectivity, individualism, productivity.
We just think that is just like the American way. The American is this whiteness are colluding.
Yeah, deeply. Yeah.
And especially in the last 2 years with the pandemic, I think more of us are starting to realize this is it. This isn't working. I'm not surviving this way. if we can draw our attention more to the role that capitalism and white supremacy are playing in our exhaustion and our fatigue, then we might be able to consider our loyalty. That was a point that I wanted to hit on as you were talking, is I think that we're really good at being loyal to women and to each other. And even I've seen, I'll just say locally, sometimes we choose our loyalty to political party over racial justice. And we might assume that one political party over the other has, you know, the advantage on, you know, we're in right, we're doing it the right way, the racial justice way. But white supremacy is not like biased towards any political party. It exists in both.
Totally.
And yeah, I think that's all I'll say on that. I don't know how vulnerable I want to be right now.
Yeah, no, I deeply appreciate your vulnerability, and I appreciate how it's different than mine as a person who's not a member of the community. And what you said, what you had me thinking about is, you know, you talked about our solidarity with other women, but I think specifically with other white women, right? And I think, to me, I think there's two things that I invite folks to sit with and think about, right? Because I was recently on a podcast and someone asked me, like, you know, when did you become a feminist and which came first, your commitment to racial justice or feminist? And I was like, I mean, I was like basically born a feminist. I was born from a feminist. I knew I knew about abortion when I was 7. Like, I was a feminist. I've always been a feminist, but I was raised to understand feminism as being able to have access to the stuff white men have. And I think what becomes really hard for a white woman feminist is when everybody doesn't want to be white men. But it never occurred to me that that's not the gold star we should all be striving for. And I think that's why in our culture today, we see specifically Black women, Indigenous folk and Indigenous women, and trans folk as such a profound threat, because I think that those pockets of folks embody on such a profound and deep level, not playing by the boxes that they've been assigned. And I say that with the understanding that oftentimes that's survival depends on it, not necessarily by choice. And that it comes with profound risk, right? Black trans women have a life expectancy of 35 years old. So there is profound risk in just living and existing outside of the binary boxes. And I think the reason that they're perceived as such a risk is because they break the rules. They show up like, this is who I am. And to me, like, that's the kind of movement I want to be a part of, not feminism that tells me I should be able to wear a pantsuit instead of a cert suit, but the one that's like, wear whatever the hell you want and do the job you want and rest when your body calls for you to rest and earn a living wage. And the group and movement that talks about not just access to choice in abortion, but access to reproductive justice. Can I afford to have babies? Can I get medical care that's going to center my wellness? Again, Black women disproportionately die in childbirth in this country. In New York City, where I live, it's up to 12 times the rate of white women in New York City. And I think nationally it's 3.5, right? That reproductive justice to white women is choice. Can I get an abortion if I want one? Reproductive justice across the board is, can I give birth safely? Can I afford birth? Can I afford childcare? Can I get maternity leave? You know, it's so much bigger. And I think I don't blame white feminism for not knowing that, but I think it is, Tamika said perfectly, our responsibility now to see, I only learned this much and there's all this. And then I think we have to be able to say, we can all get so much more when we stay together. But what'll happen is, as soon as we start to get momentum all together, someone will dangle a carrot that the white women can get and no one else can. And we'll be like, oh, but if we take it, we get it. And sorry, guys. And we saw this with the suffragettes, and we see this over and over. And I think the work comes in staying and saying, we don't want your carrot until everyone gets it. And honestly, I think that if there was if white women proved to be a meaningful threat, like we would actually stay, I think things would change so fast in this country.
Yeah. Oh man, this is like such a great conversation. I want to shout out to Olentangy River, who's made a comment on our Facebook about this is making them tear up, and they're a younger person who wants to be part of this movement. They say, I wear two hats, a Delaware resident and being a coordinator for the city of Delaware, and I'd love to continue this conversation. Victoria and I want to send that invitation out. Please keep engaging in the comments, and then we'd be happy to connect through the council page, and we'll connect you however you would like to. I'm so glad that this is useful to you. Victoria's points about how there's so much liberation and healing among the groups that have broken the norms, whether that is trans, gay, people of color. This makes so much sense to me in my personal life of where I've experienced the most healing, and where my own white girl, Issa, has also experienced a lot of sense of belonging in Delaware. And so I just hope in our community we think more about those places and how much they mean. They mean to me, they mean to all of us. I know that this gets into more system and policy, and sometimes that can feel overwhelming, right? Like, how do we put a dent in this big thing that is like hardened for centuries? And with the time we have, maybe we can shift on where do we get started? Like, what's the next best thing?
You know, I just got so excited. I threw my notebook. There's an expression that goes something like culture eats policy for lunch. This is like a, business type expression, but I think the same holds true, that culture informs policy as much as policy informs culture. And so I think I like to remind folks that, number one, I think it's easy to rally like every 4 years or maybe every 2 years at the midterms and think that voting is the way we change justice in this country. And please vote consistently, vote in your local elections. I am not anti-vote, I am hardcore vote. And I hold the philosophy that voting is step one, not like actualization, right? And so I think when we change ourselves, when we heal ourselves, when we get in community with one another, when we disrupt norms, and even if it's disrupting within ourselves, like, why do I feel so exhausted at the end of the day? And why have I allowed myself to think that's the way it's supposed to be? That could be your point today. And I think it is all so big, and we lose sight of how powerful it is to just start with ourselves. And in my experience, I think that's in a lot of ways the hardest part. And so I know I spent a lot of time wanting to be the kind of white ally who just told other white people why they were bad. I got a lot of joy out of being like, that was racist, without ever doing any self-work. So here I was, certainly also causing harm. And I think I had to really build accountability to how that reinforces the same power structure that I say I want to dismantle, right? That makes me have to still be better than somebody else. And competing with other white people is not the opposite of racism. It's not like, that's not what anti-racism is. Anti-racism is healing and community and policy and culture. So how do you shift the culture in your family? The books that you read with your kids, the school board meetings that you go to, the ways that you engage, in your maybe religious home, how you talk to the people who are ringing you up when you're buying your groceries or pumping your gas. I mean, like, I really think it starts on such an individual level, but I think also the self-work of learning how to regulate the body, take a breath, not look away, and also not like consume things, because that's also can be a numbing thing, but to just like connect back to our own humanity.
I love that. And I really appreciate the attention to local first. I think that that's what I've learned so much from Indigenous people in my life is local. Having a local relationship with people and place, and that might be beginning with like naming the rivers that go through our community, the animals that live in our backyards, and then it might be changing the way we relate to one another, both in multiracial settings, but also among white people. I love what you said about we get in this competition and we dominate one another. And sometimes in these progressive spaces, it's like, who can be the woke white person? And that's not really effective. And it certainly doesn't create an atmosphere of safety for people of color.
Nope.
So I'm thinking a lot about that. And then I think, I love that you bring attention to the body. That's how initially we connected. Victoria and I were in a kind of like a white accountability space, and someone was sharing, and I don't know, Victoria and I are just very similar, and bringing it back to the body, noticing that anxiety that like rises in your chest or like clenches around your throat, that urgency that you want to act off of, or it might be even like a lower feeling, a slower movement of like feeling immobilized and not knowing what to do or what to say. Being able to access that like grounded place and to know that you're not alone in the work. I always mention that healing happens in relationship, and community is the antidote to oppression. And so being able to work alongside one another. At the Delaware African American Heritage Council, we invite new members of any race to join. And there's different levels that people can join. There can be, entry level where you can donate and support and give your time when you can, or you can attend monthly meetings and really be engaged and help shape our work plan. Attending events like tonight and engaging in the comments and sharing with your friends and elevating the work of the council is super important. And donations are always accepted. That supports our programming, it supports scholarship. I'm so thankful for this conversation tonight. I'm thankful for the wisdom that you've offered to us, Victoria. It was really nice to have someone from outside of Delaware enter our space. And I hope people feel like there's an invitation to connect with either one of us and the council as for our next steps.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that we got to have this conversation, that I got to have it with you and with your community. So thank you.
Yeah. So if anyone would like to, we'll put the links to learn more about the council in the chat. And please stay tuned for more programming from the council throughout Black History Month. Thank you for your engagement, and we'll see you next time.